Warriors are forged in the crucible of conflict. But what happens when an entire race is born for battle? The Saiyans represent one of the most fascinating warrior cultures in the universe. Their story spanning millennia of conquest, tragedy, and transformation, from their mysterious origins on a distant world to their near extinction and eventual evolution beyond their wildest dreams. The Saiyan race has left an indelible mark on galactic history. This is their complete timeline, a saga of pride, power, and the eternal struggle between destruction and redemption that shaped not just a people, but the very fabric of reality itself. In the distant reaches of Universe 7, on a world whose name has been nearly forgotten by galactic history, the Saiyan race began their long journey toward legend. Planet Sadala was not the world most know from the tales of Goku and Vegeta. It was something far older, far more primal, and ultimately far more tragic. The original Saiyan homeworld existed in an era when the universe was younger, and conflicts between species were settled not through politics or negotiation, but through the ancient right of might. Sadala was a harsh world that bred harsh people. Its red skies blazed over landscapes scarred by constant warfare, where mountain ranges bore the marks of energy, blasts, and valleys had been carved by the fury of warriors locked in eternal combat. The early Saiyans, who called this world home, were recognizably the ancestors of those who would later shake the foundations of the cosmos. Yet they were also profoundly different. They possessed the same incredible physical strength, the same natural affinity for battle, the same pride that would define their descendants, but they lacked the focus that would later make them the universe's most feared mercenaries. Instead, their power turned inward, consuming itself in an endless cycle of tribal warfare and personal vendettas. Saiyan society on Sadala was built around the concept of strength determining worth. The strongest warriors ruled territories that expanded and contracted based on their ability to defeat challengers. There was no unified government, no central authority that could speak for the Saiyan people as a whole. Instead, countless warlords and clan leaders carved out domains through force of arms, holding them only as long as their power remained unmatched. These early Saiyans had not yet learned to transform into the great ape form that would later become their signature ability. Their tails served different purposes, acting as additional limbs in combat and as symbols of status within their warrior culture. The length and condition of a Saiyan's tail often indicated their prowess in battle, with scarred and battle-worn appendages marking veterans of countless conflicts. The architecture of Sadala reflected the martial nature of its inhabitants. Saiyan settlements were more fortress than city, with every structure designed for defense and every pathway planned as a potential battlefield. Training grounds occupied the center of every community, surrounded by living quarters that doubled as armories. Art, when it existed at all, celebrated famous battles or legendary warriors rather than exploring concepts of beauty or philosophy. What made the Saiyans of Sadala particularly dangerous was their complete inability to conceive of peace as anything other than a temporary pause between wars. To them, conflict was not just inevitable, but necessary. They believed that struggle purified the spirit, that victory over opponents was the highest form of self-expression, and that a warrior who died in battle had achieved the most honorable fate possible. This philosophy served them well in individual combat, but it proved catastrophic for their civilization as a whole. The Saiyans of Sadala never learned to channel their aggression outward against external threats. Instead, they remained trapped in an endless cycle of internal warfare that grew more destructive with each passing generation. As centuries passed, the conflicts on Sadala escalated beyond simple territorial disputes. Entire regions became uninhabitable as powerful Saiyans unleashed their full strength against one another, caring nothing for the collateral damage their battles inflicted on the world around them. What had once been a lush planet, capable of supporting a thriving population, gradually transformed into a wasteland where only the strongest could survive. The Saiyans adapted to these increasingly harsh conditions by becoming even more ruthless and powerful. Each generation that survived the devastation of their homeworld was stronger than the last, their bodies and minds honed by constant exposure to mortal danger. They developed techniques and abilities that would have been considered impossible by their ancestors, pushing the boundaries of what Saiyan physiology could achieve. Yet this very strength became their undoing. The more powerful the Saiyans became, the more damage their conflicts inflicted on Sadala itself. Mountain ranges were leveled in single battles. Oceans boiled away under the heat of energy attacks. The very bedrock of the planet cracked and shifted as warriors of incredible might clashed without thought for the consequences of their actions. The final wars that consumed Sadala were unlike anything the universe had witnessed before. Saiyans who had transcended the normal limits of their race faced each other in combat that literally tore the world apart beneath their feet. The planet's crust buckled under the strain of their battles. Its atmosphere burned with the residual energy of their attacks. The natural systems that had sustained life for millions of years collapsed under the weight of uncontrolled Saiyan power. In the end, the Saiyans destroyed their own homeworld, not through malice or calculated aggression, but through simple inability to control their own strength. They were victims of their greatest asset, consumed by the very power that made them legendary. Planet Sadala died not with the roar of conquest, but with the bitter realization that strength without wisdom is merely another form of weakness. The survivors who escaped the destruction of Sadala carried with them the ashes of a cautionary tale they would never fully understand. They had witnessed firsthand what happened when an entire race devoted itself to conflict without consideration for the consequences. Yet, rather than learning from this tragedy, most would spend the rest of their lives seeking new arenas in which to exercise the same destructive impulses that had cost them their homeworld. As their ships limped away from the dying world that had given them birth, the scattered Saiyans faced an uncertain future. They were now a people without a planet, warriors without a war to fight, survivors of a catastrophe entirely of their own making. Some would find redemption in service to others. Some would discover new purposes that transcended their violent origins. But most would simply continue the cycle that had destroyed Sadala, carrying their self-destructive nature to whatever new world would accept them. The destruction of Planet Sadala marked the end of the first chapter in Saiyan history. But it would not be the last time their greatest strength would become their greatest weakness. The lessons of their original homeworld would echo through the centuries, a reminder that power without purpose is a force that ultimately consumes itself. As the refugees spread across the galaxy in search of a new home, they remained unaware that they carried within themselves the seeds of their own repeated destruction. After drifting through the cold void of space for months, the Saiyan refugees who had escaped the destruction of Sadala finally found what appeared to be salvation. Their scouts had detected a world that seemed almost too good to be true. A planet with breathable atmosphere, abundant resources, and, most importantly, no signs of military resistance that could threaten their weakened forces. What they discovered when they landed would reshape the course of Saiyan history in ways none of them could have anticipated. Planet Plant was a world of remarkable beauty and sophistication, a stark contrast to the scarred wasteland that Sadala had become in its final years. Lush continents spread across temperate oceans, their surfaces dotted with gleaming cities that rose like crystalline monuments to advanced civilization. The architecture alone spoke of a people who had transcended the primitive concerns of survival and warfare, focusing instead on art, science, and the peaceful advancement of their society. The inhabitants of this paradise were a species called the Tuffles, and they represented everything the Saiyans were not. Where Saiyans were tall and powerfully built, the Tuffles were smaller in stature, their physical forms optimized for intellectual rather than martial pursuits. Their skin bore a distinctive purple hue, and their heads had an elongated oval shape that suggested evolutionary adaptations for enhanced cognitive capacity. Most strikingly, they possessed none of the aggressive instincts that defined Saiyan nature, having apparently evolved beyond the need for violence as a means of resolving conflicts. Tuffle's civilization had flourished for thousands of years in an environment of peace and cooperation. Their cities were marvels of engineering and planning, with transportation systems that moved citizens efficiently without pollution or noise, residential districts that balanced privacy with community interaction, and public spaces designed to promote both learning and leisure. The Tuffles had mastered technologies that the battle-focused Saiyans had never bothered to develop, creating tools and systems that enhanced quality of life rather than simply increasing destructive capacity. The scientific achievements of the Tuffles were particularly impressive. They had developed medical techniques that could extend lifespans far beyond what most species considered natural educational systems that allowed their people to master complex subjects with remarkable efficiency, and manufacturing processes that produced goods without depleting natural resources or damaging the environment. Their approach to technology was fundamentally different from what Saiyans understood, focused on harmony and sustainability rather than raw power and immediate utility. When the Saiyan refugee ships first appeared in Planet Plant's atmosphere, the Tuffle response revealed the depth of their civilized nature. Rather than viewing the newcomers as invaders to be repelled, they saw them as fellow beings in need of assistance. Tuffle leaders convened councils to discuss how best to accommodate the refugees, debating not whether to help, but how to provide aid most effectively without compromising their own society's stability. The initial contact between the two species went more smoothly than anyone had a right to expect. Tuffle negotiators, skilled in diplomacy and conflict resolution, approached the Saiyans with offers of humanitarian assistance and temporary settlement rights. They were prepared to share their world, believing that two intelligent species could surely find ways to coexist peacefully on a planet large enough to support both populations comfortably. For their part, the Saiyans were initially too exhausted and demoralized by their recent losses to cause immediate problems. The destruction of Sadala had left even the most aggressive warriors questioning their traditional approaches to existence. Many were genuinely grateful for Tuffle hospitality and seemed willing to attempt peaceful cohabitation with their benefactors. The Saiyan leadership, such as it was among the scattered survivors, agreed to Tuffle terms that granted them territory in the less developed regions of the planet. The areas assigned to Saiyan settlement were not the barren wastelands some might have expected, but rather undeveloped wilderness regions with tremendous potential for agriculture and sustainable development. The Tuffles had chosen these locations carefully, believing that giving the Saiyans room to build their own communities from scratch would provide them with a sense of ownership and purpose that would discourage future conflicts. What the Tuffles had failed to account for was the fundamental difference between their own psychology and that of their new neighbors. While Tuffle culture celebrated cooperation, intellectual achievement, and peaceful progress, Saiyan culture was built around individual strength, competitive struggle, and the glorification of conflict. These opposing worldviews could coexist temporarily, but the underlying tensions were inevitable. The early Saiyan settlements on Planet Plant were crude affairs compared to Tuffle cities, but they represented a fascinating glimpse into what Saiyan civilization might have become under different circumstances. Without the constant pressure of warfare that had defined life on Sadala, some Saiyans began to experiment with concepts that had been alien to their culture. They built structures intended to last for generations rather than merely surviving the next battle. They established agricultural systems designed to feed communities rather than just sustaining individual warriors between conflicts. Yet, even these peaceful endeavors carried the unmistakable stamp of Saiyan nature. Their buildings were constructed like fortresses, with thick walls and defensive positions built into seemingly decorative elements. Their farms were organized like military camps, with clear hierarchies and rigid discipline governing every aspect of production. Most tellingly, their community gatherings invariably devolved into competitive contests that tested various forms of combat skill. The Tuffles observed these developments with a mixture of fascination and concern. Their anthropologists and sociologists found Saiyan culture to be an intriguing subject of study, a window into evolutionary paths their own species had abandoned millennia earlier. Yet, their political leaders began to recognize that their new neighbors possessed instincts and capabilities that could pose long-term challenges to planetary stability. As months turned into years, the initial gratitude felt by many Saiyans gradually gave way to more complicated emotions. Living alongside the Tuffles provided constant reminders of everything the Saiyan refugees lacked. Where Saiyans struggled to construct basic shelters, the Tuffles lived in architectural marvels. Where Saiyans scratched out subsistence agriculture, the Tuffles had perfected techniques that produced abundant harvests with minimal effort. Where Saiyans remained dependent on primitive tools and manual labor, the Tuffles commanded technologies that seemed almost magical in their sophistication. This disparity might have been tolerable if the Saiyans had possessed their own areas of superiority to balance the equation, but the peaceful environment of Planet Plant provided little opportunity for them to demonstrate their martial prowess. The qualities that had made them legendary warriors on Sadala seemed almost irrelevant in a world where conflicts were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than trial by combat. Some Saiyans adapted to these circumstances better than others. A minority embraced the opportunity to explore aspects of existence beyond warfare, discovering talents and interests they had never been able to pursue on their war-torn homeworld. These individuals often formed friendships with Tuffles and made genuine attempts to integrate into the broader planetary community. They learned Tuffle languages, studied Tuffle sciences, and even contributed their own perspectives to collaborative projects. However, the majority of Saiyans found the transition far more difficult. Their entire cultural identity was built around concepts of strength, honor, and martial excellence that seemed to have no place in Tuffle society. They felt increasingly like guests who had overstayed their welcome, dependent on the charity of hosts whose values they could neither understand nor fully embrace. The psychological impact of this situation was profound. Saiyans, who had once commanded respect through their fighting ability, now found themselves objects of curiosity or pity. Their children grew up hearing stories of the great battles their parents had fought. But living in a world where such conflicts were not only unnecessary, but actively discouraged, the disconnect between Saiyan cultural heritage and plant reality created a sense of displacement that affected every aspect of refugee life. Tuffle attempts to address these problems, while well-intentioned, often made matters worse. Educational programs designed to help Saiyans learn useful civilian skills were perceived as condescending efforts to reform their fundamental nature. Offers to share advanced technologies were seen as reminders of Saiyan technological inferiority. Even genuine gestures of friendship were sometimes interpreted as subtle assertions of Tuffle superiority. The most problematic aspect of the situation was that both species' interpretations of events contained elements of truth. The Tuffles genuinely wanted to help, but their help inevitably came with implicit expectations that Saiyans would adapt to Tuffle norms rather than the other way around. The Saiyans genuinely struggled with their circumstances, but their responses to Tuffle assistance were often colored by pride and cultural prejudices that made productive cooperation difficult. As time passed, these underlying tensions began to manifest in increasingly visible ways. Saiyan settlements became more insular with residents interacting less frequently with their Tuffle neighbors. Cultural celebrations that had initially been shared between the species became segregated affairs. Most ominously, a growing number of Saiyans began to speak openly about their dissatisfaction with the current arrangement and their desire for a more substantial role in planetary affairs. The Tuffles, for their part, began to question whether their generous impulses had created a long-term problem they were ill-equipped to handle. Some advocated for more intensive efforts to integrate the Saiyan population, while others suggested that perhaps the two species would be better served by more complete separation. A few prescient individuals began to wonder whether the fundamental differences between Tuffle and Saiyan nature might make peaceful coexistence impossible over the long term. The stage was being set for a conflict that neither species wanted, but both seemed powerless to prevent. The Saiyans had found a new world that could provide them with everything they needed to rebuild their civilization, but they struggled to accept that world on any terms other than their own. The Tuffles had opened their society to refugees in need, but they were discovering that generosity alone could not bridge the gap between radically different approaches to existence. The peaceful cohabitation that had seemed so promising in those early days was beginning to reveal its fragile foundations. Planet Plant had room for both species, but it remained to be seen whether it had room for both philosophies of life that they represented. The answer to that question would be written in the blood of the war that was slowly but inevitably approaching. The transformation from uneasy coexistence to open warfare did not happen overnight. Like many conflicts that reshape civilizations, the Saiyan-Tuffle War began with a series of smaller incidents that gradually escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. What started as cultural misunderstandings and economic disputes would ultimately become one of the most devastating conflicts in the recorded history of Universe 7, a decade-long struggle that would forever alter the nature of both species involved. The spark that ignited this catastrophic war can be traced to the year age 720, though the exact sequence of events remains disputed even today. Different historical accounts offer varying explanations for what finally pushed the two species beyond the point of peaceful resolution. What is clear is that, by this time, the underlying tensions that had been building for years had reached a critical mass that required only the slightest provocation to explode into violence. According to some versions of these events, the immediate cause was an incident involving Saiyan warriors who had grown frustrated with their perceived second-class status on Planet Plant. These individuals, led by emerging Saiyan nobles who would later form the core of their military hierarchy, began making increasingly aggressive demands for territory and resources. When these demands were politely but firmly rejected by Tuffle authorities, the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Other accounts suggest that the Tuffles themselves bore some responsibility for the outbreak of hostilities. According to this version of events, certain Tuffle factions had grown concerned about the growing Saiyan population and had begun implementing policies designed to limit Saiyan expansion and influence. These policies, while perhaps well-intentioned from a Tuffle perspective, were perceived by many Saiyans as discriminatory measures designed to keep them permanently subordinate. The truth, as is often the case in complex political situations, likely contains elements from both narratives. What cannot be disputed is that by age 720, both species had reached a point where compromise seemed impossible and conflict appeared inevitable. The Saiyans had grown tired of living as grateful refugees in a world that would never truly accept them as equals. The Tuffles had begun to recognize that their generous impulses had created a situation that threatened the stability of their entire civilization. The figure who emerged as the primary architect of Saiyan military strategy was King Vegeta. Though his exact title and authority during these early stages of the conflict remained somewhat unclear, what is certain is that he possessed a combination of martial prowess, strategic intelligence, and charismatic leadership that made him uniquely suited to unite the scattered Saiyan settlements under a single military command. Where previous Saiyan leaders had focused primarily on their own local concerns, King Vegeta understood that victory would require coordinated action across the entire planet. King Vegeta's approach to the coming war represented a significant evolution in Saiyan military thinking. Unlike the chaotic free-for-all battles that had characterized warfare on Sadala, he recognized that defeating the technologically superior Tuffles would require careful planning, disciplined execution, and above all, patience. He spent months traveling between Saiyan settlements, building alliances, coordinating resources, and most importantly, convincing his fellow warriors that short-term restraint would lead to long-term victory. The Saiyan war machine that King Vegeta assembled was unlike anything their species had previously created. Rather than relying solely on individual combat prowess, he organized his forces into cohesive units with specialized roles and clear command structures. Reconnaissance teams gathered intelligence on Tuffle defenses and capabilities. Engineering Corps prepared siege equipment and battlefield modifications. Supply chains ensured that Saiyan forces could sustain extended campaigns without returning to their home territories for resupply. Perhaps most importantly, King Vegeta understood that this war would be as much about morale and propaganda as it would be about military tactics. He worked tirelessly to frame the conflict in terms that would inspire maximum Saiyan commitment, while simultaneously undermining Tuffle resolve. The Saiyans were not aggressors seeking to destroy a peaceful civilization, he argued, but oppressed people fighting for their rightful place in the world that had supposedly welcomed them. When the war finally began, the initial battles revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of each side's approach to conflict. The Saiyans possessed overwhelming advantages in individual combat ability, physical resilience, and sheer determination. A single Saiyan warrior could often defeat multiple Tuffle opponents in direct confrontation, and their natural aggression made them fearless in situations that would terrify most species. Their ability to fight effectively with minimal equipment or support also gave them significant tactical flexibility. The Tuffles, however, compensated for their physical disadvantages through superior technology, better organization, and more sophisticated strategic planning. Their weapons were more advanced and effective than anything the Saiyans could produce independently. Their communication systems allowed for coordination across vast distances. Their manufacturing capabilities meant they could replace losses and maintain supply lines far more efficiently than their opponents. The early phases of the war were characterized by a series of rapid Saiyan advances, followed by equally rapid Tuffle counterattacks. Saiyan forces would overwhelm isolated Tuffle positions through sheer ferocity and determination, only to find themselves overextended and vulnerable to technological retaliation. Tuffle forces would use their superior equipment and planning to achieve tactical victories, only to discover that destroying Saiyan forces required far more resources than their pre-war calculations had anticipated. Both sides quickly learned that their initial assumptions about the conflict had been dangerously naive. The Saiyans had expected their physical superiority to translate into quick, decisive victories that would force rapid Tuffle surrender. Instead, they found themselves facing opponents who could match their tactical intelligence while possessing technological advantages that neutralized many traditional Saiyan strengths. The Tuffles had assumed that their advanced weapons and defensive capabilities would make the cost of continued Saiyan aggression prohibitively high. Instead, they discovered that Saiyan determination and resilience made them far more willing to accept casualties than Tuffle strategic models had predicted. As the months stretched into years, the war began to take on characteristics that neither side had anticipated. What had started as a conflict over territory and political status gradually transformed into something far more fundamental. A struggle between two completely different philosophies of existence. For the Saiyans, the war became a test of their entire cultural identity, a chance to prove that their warrior heritage remained relevant in a changing universe. For the Tuffles, it became a desperate fight for survival against opponents whose motivations they could never fully understand. The technological arms race that developed during these middle years of the conflict pushed both species to innovations they would never have achieved in peacetime. Tuffle scientists worked frantically to develop weapons and defensive systems capable of stopping opponents who seemed to grow stronger with each passing battle. Saiyan tacticians learned to adapt and counter increasingly sophisticated enemy technologies through creative applications of their natural abilities. The civilian populations of both species suffered tremendously during this period. Tuffle cities, once symbols of peaceful prosperity, became fortified strongholds surrounded by defensive barriers and weapon emplacements. Saiyan settlements, never particularly comfortable by galactic standards, became Spartan military camps where every resource was dedicated to supporting the war effort. Normal life, as both species had previously understood it, essentially ceased to exist. The psychological impact of the prolonged conflict was particularly severe for the Tuffles, whose peaceful culture had not prepared them for the realities of extended warfare. Many struggled with the moral implications of the increasingly violent measures they felt compelled to take in their own defense. Others became consumed by hatred and fear that transformed them into something their pre-war selves would have found unrecognizable. For the Saiyans, the war represented both vindication and tragedy. On one hand, it proved that their warrior culture remained viable and valuable in a universe that had seemed to have no place for such things. On the other hand, it forced them to confront the destructive potential of their own nature in ways that many found deeply troubling. The conflict was simultaneously everything they had trained for and everything they had hoped to leave behind when they fled Sadala. By the 5th year of the war, both sides had reached a state of exhausted stalemate. Neither possessed the resources for decisive victory, yet neither could afford the political consequences of seeking peace. The war had become self-sustaining, fed by mutual hatred and the sunk costs of previous sacrifices. Leaders on both sides privately acknowledged that the conflict was destroying everything they had originally sought to protect. But public momentum made retreat politically impossible. The battles during this middle period were characterized by increasing brutality and decreasing strategic coherence. Both sides had suffered enormous casualties among their most experienced military leaders, leaving younger and often more radical commanders in positions of authority. These new leaders, having known nothing but war during their formative years, pursued tactics that their predecessors would have considered excessive or counterproductive. It was during this darkest period of the conflict that the factor that would ultimately determine its outcome began to assert itself. Planet Plant's unique astronomical characteristics, which had been little more than scientific curiosities during peacetime, were about to become the decisive element in the war's resolution. The planet's orbital mechanics created lunar cycles that occurred far less frequently than those experienced by most inhabited worlds, a peculiarity that had never seemed particularly significant to either species. The Tuffles, with their advanced understanding of astronomy and planetary science, were well aware of these cycles and had even incorporated them into their agricultural and social planning. However, they had never considered the possibility that celestial events might have military implications. The Saiyans, focused as they were on immediate tactical concerns, had largely ignored astronomical phenomena that seemed irrelevant to their ground-based campaigns. As the war entered its final phase, neither side could have anticipated that the resolution of their decade-long struggle would come not from superior strategy or advanced technology, but from an ancient biological transformation that most Saiyans had forgotten they possessed. The stage was set for a climactic event that would demonstrate the terrible truth that sometimes victory and genocide are separated only by the light of a full moon. The approaching lunar event would not merely end the war between Saiyans and Tuffles. It would fundamentally alter the balance of power on Planet Plant in ways that neither species could have imagined when their conflict began. The civilization that emerged from this final transformation would be shaped by the trauma of total victory and the burden of complete responsibility for an entire world's future. The full moon that shone over Planet Plant in the final days of the Saiyan-Tuffle War changed everything in a matter of hours. When the lunar light triggered the great ape transformation across the entire Saiyan population. The decade-long conflict reached its brutal conclusion with the complete extinction of Tuffle civilization. The Saiyans found themselves the undisputed masters of a world they had renamed Planet Vegeta. But their victory brought with it a problem that would define the next phase of their history. King Vegeta surveyed the aftermath of their triumph with a mixture of pride and growing concern. The Saiyans had proven their superiority in the most decisive way possible, but the very totality of their victory had eliminated the external threat that had given their warrior culture purpose and direction. Without the Tuffles to fight against, the Saiyans faced the same fundamental challenge that had destroyed their original homeworld on Sadala. They were a people defined by conflict. Yet, they had removed all enemies from their immediate environment. The months following the end of the war revealed the depth of this problem. Saiyan warriors, accustomed to channeling their aggression against external foes, began turning on each other with increasing frequency. Disputes over territory, resources, and status that had been set aside during the war now erupted into violent confrontations. The unity that King Vegeta had so carefully cultivated during the conflict began to fracture as individual ambitions reasserted themselves in the absence of a common enemy. The infrastructure left behind by the Tuffles presented both opportunities and challenges for the victorious Saiyans. The advanced cities, manufacturing facilities, and technological systems represented resources beyond anything their species had previously possessed. Yet most Saiyans lacked the knowledge or inclination to maintain these sophisticated systems. The result was a gradual decay of Tuffle achievements as Saiyan society struggled to adapt peaceful technologies to their warrior-focused culture. King Vegeta recognized that his people stood at a crossroads that would determine their long-term survival. They could allow their natural aggressive instincts to reassert themselves, potentially destroying Planet Vegeta as they had destroyed Sadala. Alternatively, they could find new outlets for their warrior nature that would preserve both their cultural identity and their new homeworld. The solution he developed would transform the Saiyans from planet-bound warriors into the most feared mercenary force in the galaxy. The decision to look beyond Planet Vegeta for military opportunities represented a fundamental shift in Saiyan strategic thinking. Rather than viewing space as an empty void to be crossed when fleeing disaster, King Vegeta began to see it as an infinite battlefield filled with potential enemies and opportunities for conquest. This expansion of Saiyan horizons coincided with their growing mastery of the space travel technology they had inherited from the Tuffles. The first extraplanetary expeditions launched by the Saiyans were relatively modest affairs, scouting missions designed to identify nearby worlds and assess potential threats or opportunities. These early ventures revealed a galaxy far more complex and dangerous than most Saiyans had imagined, filled with species possessing technologies and abilities that rivaled or exceeded their own. However, they also demonstrated that Saiyan combat prowess remained exceptional even by galactic standards. It was during one of these exploratory missions that the Saiyans made contact with representatives of the Arcosian race, members of the species that would later produce the Galactic Emperor known as Frieza. This first encounter between Saiyans and Arcosians would have consequences that neither species could have anticipated, setting in motion a relationship that would define Saiyan culture for generations. The Arcosians who approached the Saiyans presented themselves as successful interstellar merchants and diplomats, representatives of a civilization that had achieved prosperity through trade and technological advancement rather than conquest. They expressed admiration for Saiyan military capabilities and suggested that mutually beneficial arrangements might be possible between their respective peoples. What they did not reveal was their connection to the emerging Frieza force, or the true nature of their intentions regarding Saiyan society. The initial agreements between Saiyans and Arcosians seemed to address both species' needs perfectly. The Arcosians required military services for various commercial and territorial disputes they claimed to be facing throughout their sphere of influence. The Saiyans needed external conflicts that could absorb their aggressive energies while providing resources to support their developing civilization. A straightforward mercenary relationship appeared to benefit everyone involved. King Vegeta approached these early contracts with considerable caution, recognizing that his people were entering a larger galactic community where their lack of political and technological sophistication could be exploited by more experienced civilizations. He insisted on limited engagements that would allow the Saiyans to gain experience with interstellar warfare while minimizing their exposure to potential betrayal or manipulation. The first Saiyan military campaigns, conducted under Arcosian sponsorship, were remarkable successes that exceeded even optimistic projections. Saiyan warriors adapted quickly to space-based combat. Their natural resilience and fighting instincts proving highly effective against opponents who had never faced such determined and physically powerful adversaries. Planet after planet fell to Saiyan assault forces, often with minimal casualties among the attacking troops. These victories had profound effects on Saiyan culture and self-perception. Warriors who had spent years fighting a grinding war of attrition against the technologically advanced Tuffles discovered that most galactic civilizations were far less capable of resisting Saiyan military superiority. The confidence and pride that had been shaken by the long struggle on Planet Plant was restored and amplified by a series of easy conquests against external foes. The economic benefits of their mercenary activities allowed Planet Vegeta to undergo rapid development and modernization. Saiyan settlements expanded from crude military camps into proper cities, though ones that retained the fortress-like characteristics that reflected their inhabitants' priorities. The population grew steadily as improved living conditions and reduced internal conflict allowed more Saiyan children to survive to adulthood. The integration of captured technologies and resources from conquered worlds accelerated Saiyan technological advancement beyond what they could have achieved through independent research and development. Weapons, armor, communication systems, and spacecraft from dozens of different civilizations were studied, modified, and incorporated into Saiyan military doctrine. This technological synthesis created hybrid systems that combined alien sophistication with Saiyan durability and combat effectiveness. Perhaps Most importantly, the mercenary lifestyle provided a socially acceptable outlet for the competitive instincts that had traditionally caused internal strife within Saiyan communities. Warriors could prove their superiority through their success in external campaigns rather than by challenging their own people. Status and advancement within Saiyan society became tied to military achievements against galactic opponents rather than victories over fellow Saiyans. The class structure that emerged during this period reflected these new priorities and opportunities. Elite Saiyans distinguished themselves through exceptional performance in the most challenging campaigns, earning positions of leadership and access to the finest equipment and training. Middle-class warriors handled the bulk of routine military operations, building reputations and accumulating resources through consistent competence rather than spectacular heroics. Lower-class Saiyans often served in support roles or were assigned to less prestigious but still important missions that contributed to overall Saiyan military effectiveness. This hierarchy was reinforced by the practice of measuring and classifying Saiyan power levels from birth, a system that had existed in crude form since their earliest history, but was refined and institutionalized during the mercenary period. Saiyans with high power levels received advanced training and prestigious assignments, while those with lower measurements were channeled into specialized roles that maximized their contributions to society. Despite their limited combat potential, the cultural changes that accompanied Saiyan expansion into galactic mercenary work were subtle but significant. Traditional Saiyan values of strength, courage, and martial excellence remained central to their identity, but new concepts of loyalty, discipline, and strategic thinking became increasingly important. The chaotic individualism that had characterized their ancestors on Sadala gave way to a more organized approach to warfare that emphasized unit cohesion and coordinated tactics. Family relationships among the Saiyans evolved to accommodate the demands of their new lifestyle. The emotional detachment that had traditionally characterized Saiyan parenting became even more pronounced as military duties frequently separated parents from their children for extended periods. However, this same detachment allowed Saiyan families to function effectively despite the constant dangers and uncertainties of mercenary life. The legend of the Super Saiyan, which had existed in various forms throughout Saiyan history, took on new significance during this period of galactic expansion. Warriors who encountered particularly challenging opponents or achieved exceptional victories were sometimes speculated to be approaching the legendary transformation that had supposedly occurred once every 1,000 years. These stories served both as inspiration for individual achievement and as a source of cultural identity that connected contemporary Saiyans to their mythical past. King Vegeta himself became a figure of almost legendary status during these prosperous years, successfully balancing the competing demands of maintaining internal order while managing external military commitments. His leadership style evolved from the revolutionary fervor that had characterized his role during the Tuffle War to a more mature approach that emphasized long-term strategic planning and careful resource management. The royal court that developed around King Vegeta reflected the increasing sophistication of Saiyan society. while maintaining the martial values that defined their culture. Elite warriors, successful commanders, and trusted advisors formed a governing council that could make complex decisions about military deployments, resource allocation, and diplomatic relationships. This concentration of power and expertise allowed the Saiyans to function effectively as both a planetary civilization and an interstellar military force. As the years passed and Saiyan military success continued, the relationship with their Arcosian sponsors began to evolve in ways that neither side had originally anticipated. What had started as a straightforward commercial arrangement gradually became something more complex and potentially dangerous, as the true nature of the galactic power structure they had entered became increasingly apparent to Saiyan leadership. The growing awareness that their Arcosian contacts were connected to larger and more powerful organizations created both opportunities and concerns for the Saiyan leadership. Greater access to advanced technology and more lucrative military contracts was balanced against the risk of becoming dependent on patrons whose ultimate intentions might not align with Saiyan interests. Yet, for the moment, the arrangement continued to serve both sides effectively. Planet Vegeta had been transformed from a war-torn refugee settlement into the hub of a thriving military enterprise. The Saiyan people had found a sustainable way to express their warrior nature while building a civilization that could support future generations. The golden age of Saiyan culture had reached its peak, though shadows were already beginning to gather that would threaten everything they had achieved. The golden age of Saiyan civilization that had flourished under the mercenary arrangement with the Arcosians was built on foundations far more precarious than most Saiyans realized. While Planet Vegeta thrived and Saiyan warriors carved out a reputation as the galaxy's most formidable fighting force, the true architects of their success were growing increasingly concerned about the monster they had helped create. The relationship that had once seemed mutually beneficial was transforming into something far more dangerous as the Galactic Emperor, known as Frieza, began to view his Saiyan allies as an existential threat rather than a valuable asset. Frieza's paranoia regarding the Saiyans did not develop overnight, but grew gradually as reports from various campaigns demonstrated just how powerful these warriors had become. What had initially impressed him as useful brutality began to concern him as potential rebellion. The same strength that made the Saiyans such effective instruments of conquest also made them capable of challenging his own authority if they ever chose to do so. The Emperor, who had built his empire on the principle that he alone possessed ultimate power, could not tolerate the existence of subordinates who might one day rival his own abilities. The legend of the Super Saiyan, which the Saiyans themselves often dismissed as mythological nonsense, took on ominous significance in Frieza's calculations. His spies and informants had gathered fragments of Saiyan oral traditions that spoke of a transformation occurring once every 1,000 years, creating a warrior with power beyond normal comprehension. Whether or not such transformations were actually possible, the fact that Saiyans believed in them suggested a cultural expectation of transcending current limitations that Frieza found deeply troubling. Mathematical projections based on observed Saiyan power growth rates, painted an alarming picture for Frieza's long-term security. If individual Saiyans continued to grow stronger at their current pace, it was only a matter of time before some of them approached power levels that could challenge even Frieza himself. Combined with their increasing numbers and growing technological sophistication, the Saiyan population represented a ticking time bomb that could eventually explode throughout his empire. The decision to eliminate the Saiyan race was not made impulsively, but rather emerged from cold, strategic calculation combined with Frieza's fundamental inability to tolerate potential threats to his supremacy. He had built his empire by destroying anyone who might eventually challenge him, and the Saiyans had simply grown too powerful to be allowed to continue existing. The only question was how to accomplish their destruction without triggering the kind of desperate resistance that might allow some of them to escape and seek revenge. King Vegeta, meanwhile, had begun to sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the relationship between his people and their Arcosian patrons. The contracts and assignments that had once seemed straightforward military engagements were becoming increasingly suspicious in their nature and timing. Saiyan forces were being deployed in ways that seemed designed to test their limits rather than accomplish specific strategic objectives. Most ominously, the communication systems that normally kept Planet Vegeta in contact with deployed forces were experiencing mysterious failures that prevented accurate assessment of casualties and mission status. The recall order that summoned all Saiyan forces back to Planet Vegeta came with explanations that satisfied most warriors, but raised serious concerns among more thoughtful military leaders. Official communications spoke of new assignments that would require the full strength of the Saiyan military. But the timing and circumstances of the recall suggested something far more sinister. King Vegeta's attempts to obtain clarification from Frieza's representatives were met with evasive responses that confirmed his growing suspicions. Among the Saiyans who recognized the approaching danger was Bardock, a low-class warrior whose recent experiences had given him insights that most of his people lacked. Unlike the elite Saiyans, who focused primarily on political and military strategy, Bardock's ground-level perspective had exposed him to information that painted a disturbing picture of Frieza's true intentions. His attempts to warn other Saiyans were largely dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a warrior traumatized by recent combat experiences. The royal court found itself divided between those who shared King Vegeta's concerns and those who believed that Saiyan military superiority made them effectively untouchable. The optimists argued that Frieza needed the Saiyans too much to seriously consider eliminating them, while the pessimists worried that their very value made them too dangerous to be allowed to live. This internal debate consumed precious time that might have been used to prepare defensive measures or evacuation plans. The situation was complicated by the presence of young Prince Vegeta, King Vegeta's son and heir, who was away from Planet Vegeta on what appeared to be a routine mission. The prince represented both the future of the Saiyan royal line and a potential hostage who could be used to manipulate King Vegeta's responses to any crisis. The king's paternal instincts warred with his duties as a leader, creating emotional conflicts that affected his strategic decision-making during these crucial final days. The case of Broly, the legendary Super Saiyan infant whose power had so disturbed King Vegeta years earlier, added another layer of complexity to the unfolding crisis. The child's exile to the desolate world of Vampa had been intended to eliminate a potential threat to royal authority, but the approaching destruction of Planet Vegeta transformed that exile into an inadvertent act of preservation. Paragus, Broly's father, remained consumed by hatred for King Vegeta, and unaware that his forced separation from Saiyan society might ultimately save both their lives. Bardock's growing desperation led him to take increasingly dramatic actions to convince his fellow Saiyans of the approaching danger. His warnings about Frieza's true intentions were dismissed by most as impossible paranoia. But a few individuals began to take his concerns seriously. These converts formed a small network of Saiyans who began quietly preparing for the worst while hoping their fears would prove unfounded. The personal crisis that drove Bardock to his most desperate act was his realization that his youngest son, Kakarot, was among the most vulnerable members of Saiyan society. As a newborn with a relatively low power level, the infant would be of no value to Frieza as a hostage, and would certainly be eliminated along with the rest of the Saiyan population. Bardock's paternal instincts, normally suppressed by Saiyan cultural norms, erupted with an intensity that surprised even him. The decision to send Kakarot away from Planet Vegeta represented a desperate gamble based on incomplete information and slim hopes for survival. Bardock and his wife Gine had identified Earth as a potential sanctuary based on sketchy intelligence reports, suggesting it was inhabited by a weak species that posed no threat to Saiyan colonization efforts. The planet's remote location and apparent lack of strategic value made it an unlikely target for Frieza's attention, offering the best chance for their son's long-term survival. The launch of Kakarot's escape pod was conducted in secrecy and haste, with barely enough time to program basic navigation parameters before Frieza's forces moved into position around Planet Vegeta. Bardock and Gine were forced to make their final parental decision based on hope rather than certainty, sending their infant son toward an unknown fate that might offer the only chance for any part of their family legacy to survive the approaching apocalypse. King Vegeta's final attempt to resist Frieza's plans took the form of a desperate assault on the Emperor's flagship, a last-ditch effort to eliminate the threat before it could destroy his people. The king gathered his most loyal and powerful warriors for what they all understood would likely be a suicide mission, but one that might purchase enough time for some Saiyans to escape or organize more effective resistance efforts. The confrontation between King Vegeta and Frieza was less a battle than a demonstration of the vast power differential that had always existed between them. Despite his royal title and considerable personal strength, King Vegeta was utterly outmatched by an opponent whose true capabilities had been carefully concealed throughout their previous relationship. The ease with which Frieza destroyed the Saiyan King served as a brutal reminder that the mercenary arrangement had always been based on Frieza's choice rather than Saiyan strength. Bardock's final stand against Frieza's forces was motivated by a combination of rage, desperation, and the slim hope that someone might still be able to warn the galaxy about the Emperor's true nature. His solitary assault on the massive energy attack that Frieza launched toward Planet Vegeta was both futile and heroic, representing the Saiyan warrior spirit at both its most noble and most tragic. The destruction of Planet Vegeta was accomplished with a casual efficiency that underscored Frieza's contempt for the people he was eliminating. The supernova attack that obliterated the planet left no trace of the civilization that had once thrived there, erasing millennia of Saiyan history in a matter of seconds. The death toll included not only the entire planetary population, but also most of the Saiyan military forces that had been recalled from their various assignments throughout the galaxy. The cover story that Frieza subsequently spread about Planet Vegeta's destruction was a masterpiece of disinformation that served multiple purposes simultaneously. By claiming that the planet had been destroyed by a meteor impact, he avoided taking public credit for genocide while simultaneously discouraging any surviving Saiyans from seeking revenge. The story also reinforced his reputation for ruthlessness among potential enemies while maintaining plausible deniability for those who preferred not to acknowledge his crimes. The immediate aftermath of Planet Vegeta's destruction left the galaxy with fewer than a dozen surviving Saiyans scattered across various locations. Most were unaware that their homeworld had been destroyed, let alone that they represented the remnants of what had once been one of the universe's most formidable warrior races. The cultural knowledge, military traditions, and technological achievements of Saiyan civilization had been effectively erased, surviving only in the fragmented memories of individuals who had lost everything that had once given their lives meaning. Frieza's satisfaction with the successful elimination of the Saiyan threat was tempered by nagging concerns about whether his actions had truly solved the problem or merely postponed it. The Emperor's spies continued to monitor the surviving Saiyans for signs of growing power or coordinated resistance efforts, but the scattered nature of the survivors made such coordination seem impossible. For the moment, the greatest threat to Frieza's empire appeared to have been neutralized through decisive action. The destruction of Planet Vegeta marked the end of the Saiyan Golden Age and the beginning of a diaspora that would ultimately lead to consequences far beyond anything Frieza could have imagined. The very act of scattering the survivors across the galaxy had unknowingly planted the seeds of future challenges that would eventually grow to threaten not just Frieza's empire, but the fundamental balance of power throughout the universe. The Saiyan story was far from over, but it would continue in ways that neither the victims nor the perpetrator of this genocide could possibly have foreseen. In the immediate aftermath of Planet Vegeta's destruction, the universe contained fewer than a dozen surviving members of what had once been one of its most formidable warrior races. These scattered individuals, spread across vast distances and unaware of each other's existence, represented the final remnants of millennia of Saiyan history and culture. Each survivor would face the challenge of preserving their heritage while adapting to circumstances that none of their ancestors could have imagined, leading to divergent paths that would reshape the very meaning of what it meant to be Saiyan. The most famous of these survivors, though he would not learn his true origins for many years, was the infant Kakarot, whose escape pod had been launched toward Earth during the final hours before Planet Vegeta's destruction. His journey through space lasted several months, during which the automated systems in his pod sustained his life while projecting educational materials designed to prepare him for his intended role as a planetary conqueror. The programming that was meant to turn him into an agent of Saiyan expansion would be disrupted by circumstances that transformed his entire destiny. When Kakarot's pod finally crashed on Earth, it was discovered by an elderly martial artist named Gohan, who lived alone in the remote wilderness of Mount Paozu. The old man's decision to adopt the alien child represented one of the most consequential acts of kindness in galactic history. Though neither he nor the infant could have understood its ultimate significance, the name Goku that Gohan gave to his adopted grandson would eventually become synonymous with heroism throughout the universe. The early years of Goku's life on Earth were marked by a gradual but profound transformation of his Saiyan nature. The violent programming that should have driven him to conquer and destroy was overridden by the gentle influence of Grandpa Gohan, who embodied everything that Saiyan culture traditionally rejected: compassion, restraint, respect for all life, and the pursuit of strength for protection rather than domination became the foundational principles that shaped Goku's developing personality. The loss of Goku's tail, which occurred during his childhood, symbolically severed one of his last connections to his Saiyan heritage, while simultaneously removing the threat of uncontrolled great ape transformations. Without the constant reminder of his alien nature, Goku was free to develop as a human child would, absorbing Earth's values and forming relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the hierarchical power structures that had defined Saiyan society. The martial arts training that Goku received from various Earth Masters represented a complete departure from traditional Saiyan approaches to combat development, where Saiyan warriors had focused primarily on raw power and aggressive dominance. Earth's martial arts emphasized technique, discipline, and the harmony between mind and body. These teachings would prove to be the foundation for transformations and abilities that exceeded anything achieved by the ancient Saiyan civilization. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Prince Vegeta was experiencing a very different form of survival that preserved far more of traditional Saiyan culture, while subjecting him to psychological torments that would shape his personality for decades. As one of the few Saiyans absent from Planet Vegeta during its destruction, the young prince found himself in the impossible position of being simultaneously the heir to a destroyed kingdom and a slave to his people's murderer. Vegeta's continued service in Frieza's forces after the destruction of his homeworld represented a complex psychological adaptation that combined pragmatic survival instincts with barely controlled rage. Unable to challenge Frieza directly without facing certain death, the prince channeled his fury into becoming the perfect weapon, excelling in his missions while privately planning for the day when he would be strong enough to claim his revenge. The relationship between Vegeta, Nappa, and Raditz during this period embodied both the preservation and corruption of Saiyan military traditions. As the last representatives of their race's warrior culture, they maintained many of the customs and hierarchies that had defined their society on Planet Vegeta. Yet, their service to Frieza required them to suppress the Saiyan pride that had once been their defining characteristic, creating internal conflicts that manifested in increasingly brutal behavior during their missions. Nappa, as Vegeta's loyal retainer and military advisor, represented the old guard of Saiyan nobility, attempting to maintain traditional protocols under impossible circumstances. His unwavering devotion to the prince provided continuity with the royal traditions of Planet Vegeta, while his savage approach to combat preserved the fearsome reputation that Saiyans had earned throughout the galaxy. Yet beneath his apparent contentment with their situation lay a deep-seated rage at their reduced circumstances. Raditz occupied the lowest position in their small hierarchy, serving as both a reminder of their people's broader population and a symbol of how far the mighty Saiyan race had fallen. His relatively modest power level and status as Kakarot's older brother made him a living connection to the ordinary Saiyans who had perished with their planet, while his bitter resentment at his circumstances reflected the psychological damage that survival had inflicted on all of them. The three surviving Saiyans in Frieza's service developed a distorted version of their ancestral culture that emphasized the most brutal aspects of their warrior heritage, while suppressing the communal bonds that had provided stability to their society. Their loyalty to each other was based more on shared trauma and mutual dependence than on genuine affection or respect, creating relationships that were simultaneously unbreakable and deeply dysfunctional. On the remote world of Vampa, Broly and his father Paragus were enduring a very different form of exile that would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the legendary Saiyans' development. The harsh environment of their prison planet created conditions that pushed Broly's already extraordinary power to levels that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, while simultaneously denying him the social development that might have taught him to control his abilities. Paragus spent the years following Planet Vegeta's destruction consumed by hatred for King Vegeta and plans for revenge that he never suspected had become impossible to fulfill. His obsessive focus on returning to challenge the royal family prevented him from recognizing that his son's growing power represented something far more significant than a tool for settling old grievances. The isolation that should have protected them from galactic conflicts instead created a powder keg of legendary proportions. Broly's development during these formative years was shaped by the unique combination of his incredible genetic potential and the extreme survival pressures of Vampa's hostile environment. Without the social constraints that had limited other Saiyans' power development, his abilities grew at a rate that exceeded even the most optimistic projections about legendary Super Saiyan potential. Yet, this same isolation prevented him from learning the emotional control that might have made his power manageable. The father-son relationship between Paragus and Broly represented both the preservation and perversion of Saiyan family structures under extreme stress. Paragus's attempts to control and direct his son's development were motivated by a mixture of paternal protectiveness and selfish ambition that reflected the complex emotional dynamics that had characterized Saiyan society. Broly's gradual realization of his own power created tensions that neither of them was equipped to resolve peacefully. Tarbell, Prince Vegeta's younger brother, had been sent away from Planet Vegeta years before its destruction due to his gentle nature and low power level, qualities that made him unsuitable for the royal family by traditional Saiyan standards. His exile, which had originally been intended as a shameful banishment, became an inadvertent act of salvation that allowed him to develop along lines that would have been impossible within Saiyan society. The distant world where Tarbell made his new home provided him with opportunities to explore aspects of existence that Saiyan culture had traditionally ignored or discouraged. His marriage to an alien woman and adoption of peaceful civilian life represented a complete rejection of warrior traditions, yet also demonstrated alternative paths that Saiyan genetics could take when freed from cultural constraints. The contrast between Tarbell's peaceful development and his brother's continued embrace of warrior identity illustrated the flexibility of Saiyan nature when subjected to different environmental pressures. While Vegeta channeled his heritage into becoming the ultimate warrior prince, Tarbell channeled his into becoming something that previous generations of Saiyans would not have recognized as legitimate, yet which represented its own form of strength and achievement. The psychological impact of survival on each of these scattered Saiyans created unique adaptations that preserved different aspects of their ancestral culture, while developing new characteristics that reflected their individual circumstances. Goku's transformation into Earth's protector maintained the Saiyan drive for constant improvement while redirecting it toward noble purposes. Vegeta's evolution into the Prince of all Saiyans preserved royal traditions, while adapting them to the reality of being a people without a planet. The gradual awakening of Saiyan potential in these survivors occurred through exposure to challenges and emotions that their ancestors had never experienced. The bonds of friendship and love that Goku formed on Earth provided access to power sources that purely warrior-focused training could never unlock. The humiliation and rage that Vegeta experienced during his years of servitude created motivational forces that drove him beyond traditional limits. The preservation of Saiyan genetics across this diaspora ensured that their unique evolutionary advantages would not be lost, despite the destruction of their civilization. Each survivor carried within their DNA the potential for transformations and abilities that represented millions of years of development on their original homeworld. The question was whether these potentials could be unlocked under the radically different circumstances they now faced. The cultural knowledge that survived with these scattered individuals was fragmented and incomplete, consisting mainly of combat techniques, transformation legends, and fragments of historical memory that often contradicted each other. None possessed a complete understanding of their people's true history or the full range of abilities that Saiyan physiology could potentially achieve. This incomplete knowledge would both hinder and help their future development in unexpected ways. The stage was being set for reunions and revelations that would occur years or decades later, when these scattered survivors would gradually discover each other's existence and begin to piece together their shared heritage. The Saiyan race had been reduced to its absolute minimum, but the genetic and cultural diversity represented by the survivors would ultimately prove to be the foundation for a renaissance that exceeded anything achieved by their ancestors on Planet Vegeta. The rediscovery of Saiyan heritage began not with celebration, but with violence and tragedy that would reshape the understanding of what it meant to be the last of their kind. 24 years after Planet Vegeta's destruction, the peaceful existence that Goku had built on Earth was shattered by the arrival of his older brother Raditz, whose appearance marked the beginning of a new chapter in Saiyan history that would ultimately lead to transformations beyond anything their ancestors had achieved. Raditz's arrival on Earth was motivated by a mixture of curiosity and disappointment that reflected the complex psychology of the surviving Saiyans. Having finally located his missing brother after decades of searching, he expected to find a fellow warrior who had been fulfilling their race's traditional role as a planetary conqueror. Instead, he discovered that Kakarot had not only abandoned his mission, but had become Earth's protector, directly contradicting everything that Saiyan culture represented. The confrontation between Raditz and Goku revealed the vast gulf that had developed between different paths of Saiyan development. Where Raditz had preserved the brutal traditions of their warrior heritage, Goku had evolved into something that previous generations would have considered impossible. A Saiyan whose strength was motivated by love rather than conquest. The philosophical differences between the brothers proved to be irreconcilable, leading to a battle that would cost both their lives. The sacrifice that Goku made to defeat Raditz, allowing Piccolo to kill them both with a single attack, demonstrated a form of courage that transcended traditional Saiyan concepts of honor and glory. This act of selfless heroism, performed to protect his son and his adopted homeworld, established principles that would guide future Saiyan development along paths that emphasized protection over domination. Goku's death and subsequent training in the afterlife represented the first systematic exploration of Saiyan potential under conditions that would have been impossible during their species' original civilization. The intense gravitational training that he underwent with King Kai pushed his body beyond limits that Planet Vegeta's environment had never demanded, while the philosophical teachings he received challenged assumptions about the nature of strength and conflict that had defined Saiyan culture for millennia. The arrival of Vegeta and Nappa on Earth 1 year later brought the full force of traditional Saiyan warrior culture into direct conflict with the new path that Goku had begun to explore. Prince Vegeta's reaction to discovering that a low-class warrior had not only matched, but potentially exceeded royal power levels, challenged fundamental assumptions about Saiyan social hierarchy and the relationship between breeding and achievement. The battle that erupted when these three surviving adult Saiyans finally confronted each other represented more than just a physical conflict. It was a clash between different interpretations of what their race could become. Vegeta's insistence on maintaining traditional hierarchies and methods was challenged by Goku's demonstration that Saiyan power could be developed through cooperation, training with non-Saiyans, and motivation derived from protective rather than destructive impulses. The transformation that occurred during this epic confrontation marked the first Super Saiyan metamorphosis to occur in over 1,000 years, though it happened in a form that none of the participants initially recognized. The great ape transformation that Vegeta achieved through artificial means represented the old path of Saiyan power, relying on external triggers and uncontrolled rage. In contrast, the disciplined strength that Goku displayed suggested possibilities for internal transformation that their ancestors had never explored. The aftermath of this battle left the Saiyan survivors forever changed in their relationships with each other and their understanding of their own potential. Vegeta's defeat at the hands of combined Earth forces, including the half-Saiyan child Gohan, forced him to confront the possibility that traditional Saiyan methods might be fundamentally flawed. The humiliation of being saved by Goku's mercy, rather than achieving victory through strength, challenged his entire worldview. The introduction of Gohan into this dynamic represented something entirely unprecedented in Saiyan history. A hybrid who possessed their genetic advantages while being raised according to completely different cultural values. The child's innocent courage during the battle against Vegeta demonstrated that Saiyan power could manifest in individuals who had never been conditioned to view violence as their primary purpose in life. The years following this confrontation saw the gradual development of relationships between the surviving Saiyans that would have been impossible under their original social structure. Vegeta's reluctant integration into Earth's defender community forced him to work alongside individuals he would traditionally have considered beneath his notice, while simultaneously exposing him to training methods and philosophical approaches that challenged his assumptions about power development. The emergence of additional half-Saiyan children during this period created a new generation that would ultimately surpass both their Saiyan and human parents in ways that neither species could have achieved independently. Trunks, born to Vegeta and the human scientist Bulma, represented the fusion of royal Saiyan genetics with Earth's technological advancement and emotional openness. Goten, Goku's second son, embodied the combination of low-class Saiyan potential with the pure-hearted motivation that had driven his father's development. The ease with which these hybrid children achieved Super Saiyan transformations that had eluded their ancestors for millennia demonstrated the profound impact that environmental and cultural factors had on Saiyan power development. Where pure-blooded Saiyans had required extreme trauma or rage to trigger their transformations, the half-Saiyan children accomplished the same feats through play and friendly competition, suggesting that emotional balance rather than turmoil might be the key to unlocking their genetic potential. The training methods that evolved during this period represented a synthesis of Saiyan instincts with Earth's martial arts traditions and alien technologies that created possibilities for growth that none of these elements could have achieved independently. Gravity chambers, based on Saiyan space travel technology, allowed for physical conditioning that exceeded anything possible on Planet Vegeta, while meditation techniques derived from Earth's spiritual traditions provided mental discipline that traditional Saiyan culture had never emphasized. The philosophical evolution that accompanied these practical developments was equally significant. As the surviving Saiyans began to explore concepts of strength and purpose that their ancestors had never considered, the idea that power should be used to protect rather than conquer represented a fundamental shift in Saiyan thinking that was made possible by their exposure to Earth's values and their separation from the competitive pressures that had defined their original society. The development of fusion techniques during this period created temporary beings that combined Saiyan power with coordinated teamwork in ways that traditional warrior culture would have rejected as contrary to individual excellence. Yet these fusions demonstrated power levels that exceeded what any single Saiyan had ever achieved, suggesting that cooperation might be more effective than competition in accessing their race's ultimate potential. The Tournament of Power, which brought the survivors into contact with the universe's 6 Saiyans, provided a crucial perspective on how their race might have developed under different historical circumstances. Kaba, Caulifla, and Kale represented Saiyans who had evolved beyond their warrior phase to become protectors of their civilization, demonstrating that the path chosen by Goku and his companions was not unique, but rather represented a natural evolutionary progression for their species. The revelation that Universe 6 Saiyans had lost their tails through evolutionary adaptation rather than artificial removal suggested that the Great Ape transformation represented a vestigial ability that their race was naturally outgrowing. This discovery supported the theory that the Super Saiyan forms represented the true future of Saiyan development, replacing primitive transformations with more sophisticated expressions of their genetic potential. The relationship that developed between the Universe 7 and Universe 6 Saiyans created the first opportunity for cultural exchange between different groups of their species in generations. The sharing of transformation techniques and training methods accelerated development on both sides, while the philosophical discussions about the proper use of power helped refine the ethical framework that was emerging around Saiyan abilities. The return of Broly to this growing community of survivors represented both a connection to their species' most extreme potentials and a test of their new approach to handling dangerous power. The legendary Super Saiyan's integration into their group demonstrated that even the most unstable manifestations of Saiyan genetics could be channeled toward productive purposes when provided with appropriate support and guidance. The establishment of a new Saiyan community on Earth, informal though it was, created possibilities for preserving and developing their heritage that would have been impossible if the survivors had remained scattered across the galaxy. The combination of their various experiences and perspectives provided a more complete picture of Saiyan potential than any individual could have achieved, while their shared commitment to protecting rather than conquering established a foundation for sustainable cultural development. The training of the next generation became a collaborative effort that drew on the strengths of each survivor while compensating for their individual limitations. Goku's pure-hearted approach to martial arts, Vegeta's technical precision and royal discipline, Gohan's scholarly analysis of power development, and the hybrid children's intuitive understanding of transformation all contributed to educational methods that exceeded anything their ancestors had achieved. The emergence of new transformation levels that exceeded even the legendary Super Saiyan forms of ancient mythology, demonstrated that the survivors had not only preserved their species' potential, but had actively advanced it beyond what their original civilization had thought possible. The development of Super Saiyan 2, 3, God, and Blue forms created a progression of power that would have seemed fantastical to the warriors of Planet Vegeta. The renaissance of Saiyan culture that emerged from this period was fundamentally different from anything their race had previously achieved, combining their genetic advantages with wisdom gained through suffering and growth that transcended the limitations of their original warrior society. The survivors had not merely preserved their species, they had transformed it into something greater than it had ever been before. The achievements of the Saiyan Renaissance that had blossomed on Earth represented only the beginning of their race's true evolutionary potential. As the survivors and their hybrid descendants pushed beyond the legendary transformations that had defined the limits of ancient Saiyan mythology, they discovered that their species possessed capabilities that transcended the traditional boundaries between mortal and divine power. The path forward would require them to abandon not just the destructive impulses of their ancestors, but the very concept of power as an end in itself. The development of Ultra Instinct by Goku marked a fundamental departure from everything that Saiyan culture had previously understood about the nature of strength and combat. This technique, which had been mastered by only a handful of divine beings throughout the history of the multiverse, represented the complete abandonment of conscious thought during battle in favor of pure instinctual response. For a species that had traditionally relied on rage and determination to fuel their transformations, this requirement for perfect mental stillness presented philosophical challenges that went to the core of Saiyan identity. The process by which Goku achieved Ultra Instinct during the Tournament of Power demonstrated that Saiyan evolution had reached a point where their traditional methods of power development were no longer sufficient for accessing their ultimate potential. The technique could not be forced through willpower or triggered by emotional extremes, but rather emerged naturally when the practitioner abandoned all attachment to personal desires and allowed their body to respond without interference from conscious intention. This transcendence of traditional Saiyan approaches to combat represented more than just a new technique. It symbolized the complete evolution of their species from warriors who fought to impose their will upon reality to beings who could achieve perfect harmony with the natural flow of the universe. The transformation was not merely physical but spiritual, requiring a level of selflessness that their ancestors would have viewed as antithetical to the very concept of strength. Vegeta's parallel development of Ultra Ego represented a different but equally significant evolution of Saiyan potential, one that embraced rather than abandoned their traditional connection to pride and destruction while channeling these impulses toward divine purposes. Where Ultra Instinct required the suppression of ego and conscious thought, Ultra Ego demanded the complete embrace of one's true nature, while simultaneously transcending the limitations that such embrace had traditionally imposed. The philosophical framework underlying Ultra Ego suggested that the destructive impulses that had plagued Saiyan civilization throughout their history were not flaws to be overcome, but rather fundamental aspects of universal balance that could be wielded responsibly by beings mature enough to understand their proper application. This technique allowed Vegeta to become stronger through taking damage rather than avoiding it, transforming the Saiyan capacity for enduring punishment into a source of ever-increasing power. The development of these techniques by the two primary Saiyan survivors represented the successful resolution of the fundamental tension that had defined their race since their origins on Planet Sadala. The choice between preservation and destruction, between harmony and conflict, between selflessness and pride, had been revealed as a false dichotomy. True transcendence required the integration of opposing forces rather than the victory of one over the other. Gohan's unique path as a scholar warrior provided a third model for Saiyan evolution that combined intellectual development with martial achievement in ways that neither pure Saiyan culture nor Earth's academic traditions could have produced independently. His beast transformation represented the unleashing of Saiyan potential through scholarly dedication and protective instincts rather than traditional combat training or divine techniques. The hybrid nature that had once made Gohan feel conflicted about his dual heritage became the source of his greatest strength as he matured into an adult who could seamlessly integrate the contemplative life of a researcher with the active role of a planetary defender. His approach to power development through academic study of martial arts and transformation physiology created new methodologies that future generations could adapt to their own circumstances and interests. The emergence of Pan as the first child born into the post-Renaissance Saiyan community represented possibilities that none of the previous generations could have fully envisioned. As a quarter Saiyan, growing up in an environment where her heritage was celebrated rather than hidden or suppressed, she embodied the successful integration of multiple evolutionary paths that her ancestors had followed. Pan's natural flying ability, which manifested almost from infancy without any formal training, suggested that certain Saiyan capabilities were becoming increasingly accessible to each successive generation of hybrids. The ease with which she demonstrated powers that had required intensive training for her father and grandfather indicated that the genetic optimizations achieved through crossbreeding with humans were creating permanent improvements in Saiyan potential. The training methodologies that evolved during this period incorporated lessons learned from every phase of Saiyan development, creating educational approaches that would have been impossible to conceive on Planet Vegeta. The combination of Earth's diverse martial arts traditions, Namekian meditation techniques, Yardratian spirit control, and divine training methods created curricula that addressed physical, mental, and spiritual development simultaneously. The gravity chamber training that had been pioneered during the early years of the Renaissance was refined and expanded to create environments that could simulate the conditions necessary for accessing increasingly advanced transformation states. These facilities represented the marriage of Saiyan instincts for pushing physical limits with Earth's technological capabilities and scientific methodology. The philosophical education that accompanied physical training ensured that each new generation of Saiyans understood not just how to access their power, but why such access should be pursued responsibly. The lessons learned from their race's tragic history on Sadala and Planet Vegeta were preserved and transmitted as cautionary tales that provided context for the incredible abilities they were developing. The establishment of mentorship relationships that crossed generational and cultural boundaries created support networks that prevented the isolation and competition that had historically plagued Saiyan development, rather than each warrior pursuing individual excellence in opposition to their peers. The community approach encouraged collaborative growth that lifted everyone's potential. The impact of these developments extended far beyond the Saiyan community itself, as their presence on Earth gradually elevated the baseline power level and combat sophistication of the planet's entire population of defenders, human martial artists who trained alongside Saiyans, found themselves achieving abilities that would have been considered supernatural by previous generations, while other alien allies adopted techniques and philosophies that enhanced their own species' traditional approaches to power development. The multiversal perspective that emerged from contact with Universe 6 Saiyans and participation in divine tournaments provided crucial context for understanding their race's place in the broader cosmic order. The revelation that their development was being observed and occasionally guided by beings whose power transcended even their most advanced transformations created humility that balanced their growing capabilities. The integration of Broly into this community provided living proof that even the most extreme manifestations of Saiyan potential could be channeled toward constructive purposes when provided with appropriate support and guidance. His legendary power, which had once seemed like an uncontrollable curse, became a valuable asset for protecting Universe 7 when properly managed and directed. The techniques developed for helping Broly control his incredible abilities created methodologies that could be adapted for other Saiyans who struggled with the emotional regulation required for accessing their full potential. The community's success in socializing someone who had spent most of his life in isolation demonstrated the power of their collaborative approach to individual development. The preservation of Saiyan culture during this period required careful balance between honoring their heritage and adapting their traditions to reflect their evolved understanding of power and responsibility. Ceremonies and customs that had celebrated conquest and domination were modified to commemorate protection and growth, while maintaining the sense of pride and excellence that had always been central to their identity. The establishment of new traditions that incorporated lessons learned from their diaspora and Renaissance created cultural frameworks that could support continued evolution rather than limiting future development to predetermined patterns. These innovations ensured that Saiyan culture remained dynamic and responsive to changing circumstances, rather than becoming a static monument to their past achievements. The influence of Saiyan presence on Earth's development extended into areas that had nothing to do with combat or power levels, as their unique perspectives contributed to advances in science, technology, and philosophy that benefited the entire planetary population. The combination of their warrior instincts with Earth's collaborative spirit created innovations that neither culture could have achieved independently. The preparation of the next generation for responsibilities that would exceed anything their predecessors had faced required educational approaches that balanced practical training with ethical development. The children growing up in this environment would inherit capabilities that could reshape reality itself, making their moral and philosophical education as important as their mastery of transformation techniques. The transcendence of traditional limitations that characterized this phase of Saiyan evolution represented not an end point, but rather a new beginning, as each breakthrough revealed previously unimaginable possibilities for future development. The race that had once been defined by their capacity for destruction had become explorers of the infinite potential contained within conscious beings who chose to grow rather than merely survive. The transformation of the Saiyan race from a species that had nearly destroyed itself through endless warfare to one that served as protectors of entire universes represented more than just personal growth for the surviving individuals. It demonstrated the fundamental capacity for conscious evolution that exists within all intelligent life, the possibility that even the most destructive tendencies can be redirected toward constructive purposes when combined with wisdom gained through suffering and the guidance of those who have successfully transcended their own limitations. The current state of Saiyan civilization, if it could be called that given their small numbers and scattered locations across multiple universes, bore no resemblance to the rigid hierarchies and competitive brutality that had characterized their society on Planet Vegeta. Instead of a centralized kingdom ruled by strength and bloodline, they had become an informal network of individuals united by shared heritage and common commitment to protecting innocent life throughout the cosmos. The relationship between Universe 6 and Universe 7 Saiyans had evolved into something unprecedented in their species' history, a true partnership based on mutual respect and collaborative development, rather than the conquest and subjugation that had traditionally defined interactions between different Saiyan groups. The exchange of techniques, philosophies, and cultural perspectives had accelerated advancement on both sides while creating bonds that transcended the arbitrary boundaries imposed by multiversal structure. Cabba's role as a mentor and bridge between the two groups demonstrated how individual Saiyans could serve as catalysts for positive change throughout their extended community. His patient guidance of Universe 7 techniques and his diplomatic approach to resolving conflicts represented evolutionary adaptations that would have been impossible under traditional Saiyan social structures, where such collaborative leadership would have been viewed as weakness rather than strength. The integration of Saiyan power with Universe 6's more advanced political and social systems provided valuable insights into how their abilities could be channeled through institutional frameworks designed to serve entire civilizations rather than just individual warriors. The Sadala Defense Force represented a model for how Saiyan military traditions could be adapted to serve protective rather than aggressive purposes, while maintaining the excellence and discipline that had always characterized their approach to combat. The ongoing development of hybrid Saiyans on Earth continued to reveal new possibilities for their genetic potential, as each generation demonstrated capabilities that exceeded their predecessors, while displaying increasingly sophisticated approaches to power management and emotional regulation. The children growing up in this environment possessed not only incredible abilities, but also the cultural context necessary to use those abilities responsibly. Pan's emergence as a leader among the youngest generation of Saiyans provided evidence that their evolutionary trajectory was continuing to accelerate rather than plateauing at previously achieved levels. Her intuitive understanding of flight, energy manipulation, and transformation principles suggested that abilities which had required intensive training for previous generations were becoming increasingly natural expressions of Saiyan physiology. The educational approaches that had been developed to support these young Saiyans represented a synthesis of every successful methodology discovered during their Renaissance period, creating learning environments that addressed physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual development simultaneously. These programs ensured that each new generation would be better prepared than the last to handle the responsibilities that came with their extraordinary capabilities. The philosophical framework that governed modern Saiyan development emphasized the concept of strength as a means of service rather than dominance, fundamentally inverting the power dynamics that had driven their ancestors toward self-destruction. This shift required continuous reinforcement through both education and practical application, as the instincts that had served their species during its warrior phase remained present in their genetic makeup. The preservation of their cultural heritage during this transition required careful selection of which traditions to maintain and which to abandon or modify. The pride, determination, and excellence that had always characterized Saiyan identity were preserved and celebrated, while the aggression, competitiveness, and hierarchy that had proven destructive were gradually replaced with cooperation, mentorship, and egalitarian respect for individual contributions. The establishment of new ceremonies and customs that honored their complex history, while pointing toward their evolved future, created cultural anchors that provided continuity without limiting growth. These traditions acknowledged the tragedy of their near extinction while celebrating the opportunities that survival had created for transcending the limitations that had previously defined their existence. The influence of Saiyan presence on Earth's broader development had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate community, as their example of conscious evolution inspired other individuals and groups to examine their own destructive patterns and seek more constructive alternatives. The demonstration that fundamental change was possible provided hope for other species struggling with similar challenges. The technological innovations that had emerged from combining Saiyan training methods with Earth's scientific capabilities continued to yield discoveries that benefited both communities while creating tools that could be shared with allies throughout the universe. The gravity, manipulation, energy measurement, and biological enhancement techniques developed during this period represented genuine contributions to galactic knowledge, rather than merely destructive applications of raw power. The multiversal perspective that had become available through participation in divine tournaments and contact with alternate timeline versions of themselves provided crucial context for understanding the broader implications of their evolutionary path. The revelation that their development was part of larger patterns affecting multiple realities suggested responsibilities that extended beyond their immediate communities or even their home universes. The mentorship relationships that had been established with divine beings and cosmic entities created opportunities for continued growth that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. The guidance provided by angels, gods of destruction, and other transcendent beings offered pathways toward even greater development, while ensuring that such growth occurred within frameworks that served universal rather than merely personal interests. The ongoing challenges that the Saiyan community faced in maintaining their evolved perspective while dealing with increasingly powerful threats required constant attention to the balance between capability and responsibility. Each new level of power they achieved brought with it temptations to revert to older patterns of thinking, making their philosophical education as important as their technical training. The preparation for future generations included not only the transmission of techniques and knowledge, but also the cultivation of wisdom necessary to navigate the unique challenges that would accompany even greater power. The children being raised in this environment would inherit capabilities that could reshape reality itself, making their character development the highest priority of their education. The long-term vision that guided Saiyan development during this period encompassed not just their own continued evolution, but their role in supporting the growth of consciousness throughout the multiverse. Their unique combination of genetic potential, hard-won wisdom, and commitment to service positioned them to serve as catalysts for positive change on a scale that individual species rarely achieve. The relationship between power and purpose that had been established during their renaissance provided a template that could be adapted by other groups facing similar transitions from destructive to constructive applications of their abilities. The Saiyan example demonstrated that fundamental change was possible even for cultures that seemed irreversibly committed to harmful pattern. The integration of their martial traditions with spiritual development had created approaches to personal growth that addressed both the cultivation of ability and the wisdom necessary to use that ability appropriately. These methodologies represented genuine innovations in the field of conscious evolution, contributing to universal knowledge about the development of transcendent beings. The cosmic responsibilities that accompanied their growing power were balanced by the support systems they had created through their collaborative approach to development. Rather than facing these challenges as isolated individuals, they functioned as a network of mutual support that could address threats and opportunities that exceeded what any single being could handle effectively. The future that stretched before the Saiyan community contained possibilities that would have seemed fantastical to their ancestors, opportunities to participate in the fundamental processes by which conscious beings grow beyond the limitations of their origins to become active participants in the universe's continued evolution. Their journey from near extinction to cosmic significance provided evidence that even the most devastating failures could become foundations for unprecedented success when approached with wisdom, determination, and the support of others who shared their commitment to growth rather than mere survival. The legacy they were creating through their choices and achievements would extend far beyond their own lifespans, or even the continuation of their genetic lineage, serving as inspiration and guidance for countless other beings who might one day face similar crossroads in their own development. The Saiyan story had become a testament to the possibility of conscious evolution, proof that any being or culture could transcend its origins to become something greater than what it had been designed to be. The story of the Saiyans is ultimately one of transformation. From the violent, self-destructive warriors who obliterated their own homeworld to the defenders of entire universes, their journey represents the evolution of power tempered by wisdom. They learned that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the choice to protect. The near extinction of their race became the catalyst for something greater than they could have ever achieved on Planet Vegeta. Today, the Saiyan legacy lives on, not in conquest and domination, but in the quiet moments between battles, in the laughter of children who will never know the harsh world their ancestors created, and in the unwavering determination to be better than those who came before. The warrior spirit endures, refined by experience and guided by compassion. In the end, the greatest victory of the Saiyan race was not any battle they won, but the battle they chose to stop fighting, the cycle they chose to break, and the future they chose to build.